Well, good afternoon again, everyone, and I hope you're all enjoying our time together. It's been a real pleasure to be able to spend this afternoon with you, and we're grateful to all of our speakers today who have shared with us their insights and reflections. It's been just a beautiful experience to be a part of. As I introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, I'd also like to again express our gratitude to Dean Joel Hellman of our School of Foreign Service, to Dr. Tom Banchoff, our Vice President for Global Engagement. And I'd also like to again express our gratitude to our host, Antonio Spadaro. Father Spadaro, we're honored to be here at Civiltà Cattolica. Today's discussions have provided for us an opportunity to deepen our understanding of the global mission of the Society of Jesus. And there's perhaps no one better suited to offer our address this afternoon than Dr. Jose Casanova. For more than a decade, we've been blessed at Georgetown to have with us one of our world's most highly regarded scholars of religion, a professor in our Department of Sociology and our Department of Theology and Religious Studies. Professor Casanova, over the past few years, has helped lead work at Georgetown reflecting on the idea at the heart of this conference, the global impact of the Society of Jesus. As a senior fellow at our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, he leads several projects, including a project on globalization, religions, and the secular, an initiative that brings together leading scholars across disciplines to explore questions related to secularism and public religion. He also leads a project on Catholicism and globalization, which examines the global transformation of Catholicism from the early to the modern era. He also co-leads with our colleague, Peter Phan, our Alacuria Chair of Catholic Social Thought, a project on Asian Pacific, Latin American, and African Catholicism and globalization. Prior to this, he led for 5 years with Jocelyn Cesari, a senior fellow in our Berkeley Center and a professor in our Department of Government, a project on Islam, gender, and democracy, which studies the relationship between secularism, democracy, religion, and gender equality. He and Tom Banchoff have also led a project on Jesuits and globalization, where they held a series of events around the world that brought together an international group of interdisciplinary scholars, including right here in Rome at the Gregorian, and resulted in a scholarly publication of their writings. And he also led a project on the religious and political identities, the Mediterranean since 1492, during which he organized a series of workshops at Georgetown for scholars from around the world. A prolific author with many published books and articles, in 2012, he was honored with the Salzburger Hochschulhohen Prize in Theology for his outstanding contributions and lifelong achievements in the field of theology. And in 2017, he was selected to serve as the Kluge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the North at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress in Washington. His landmark book, Public Religions in the Modern World, published by University of Chicago Press in 1994, has been translated into several languages, including Japanese, Arabic, and Turkish. So to bring this whole process of our engagement today into a fitting closure, we have the opportunity to have with us one of the scholars we're most proud to call a part of the Georgetown University community, Professor Jose Casanova.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you, President De Gioia, for your kind introduction and for your continuous both inspiration and support. You know, this partly you convinced me to come down to Georgetown, you and Tom Banchoff, and it's one of the best decisions I ever made in my life, so thank you very much. I also want to thank our gracious host, Father Spadaro. It's a great pleasure to be back here. And it is a great honor and a great pleasure to have the opportunity to deliver this lecture on the Jesuits, Globalization, and our historical juncture. At this festive occasion, at this centennial celebration of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, examining the global impact of the Society of Jesuits. And I would like to use this opportunity to extend again this celebratory greeting to SFS Dean Joel Hellman, to all the members of the SFS community, and to all the members of the Society of Jesus here in the audience. As I was preparing this lecture, reading on the life and work of Edmund Walls, founder of the School of Foreign Service in 1919 and regent of the school until his death in 1952, I was happy to learn that Father Walls and I share the honor of being Altconvictoren, that is, alumni of the Jesuit Collegium Canisianum in Innsbruck, Austria, where we both studied theology. Walls could only stay in Innsbruck, however, 1 year, since his theological studies there were cut short by the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Walls continued his theological studies at Woodstock College in Maryland, and shortly after his ordination to the priesthood in 2016, Father Walls was appointed Dean of the College at Georgetown. However, before the end of his first year as Dean, his life career was interrupted once again by war, this time by the entry of the United States into war in 1918. Father Walls accepted the assignment of the United States War Department to help establish the ROTC program and to serve as regional director of the colleges in New England, joining the Reserve Officer Training Corps. One could say that this double interruption of his life career by war was providential, not only in the foundation of the School of Foreign Service, but also in his lifelong dedication to the study, the teaching, and the practice of foreign diplomacy and global geopolitics. Among his many foreign service assignments, one can mention his assignment in 1922 by the Vatican to lead a papal relief mission in the Soviet Union. He became totally anti-Soviet for his entire life, became a Cold Warrior war before the Cold War, but in his case, based on his knowledge of the Soviet system. His assignment in 1926 by the American bishops to organize and direct the newly established Catholic Near East Welfare Association, which would become the model of many of the Catholic relief organizations throughout the world, which have now been grouped under Caritas Internationalis. His assignment in 1928, jointly by the Vatican and the US bishops, to propose a mediation, a modus vivendi, not even a concordat, just a modus vivendi, to overcome the violent conflict between the revolutionary anti-clerical government and the Catholic Church in Mexico. His appointment in 1931 to visit Iraq to prepare the opening of a Jesuit college in Baghdad. His assignment in 1944-45 as expert consultant to the War Crimes Commission at the Nuremberg trials. Father Walls' life career of dedication to diplomacy and foreign service is no doubt extraordinary, and yet it is also in many respects a prototypical Jesuit life career. We are aware of the work of Jesuits, or of the Jesuits as pioneer global missionaries and global educators in the early modern era, in what has been called the first globalization. But in my lecture today, I want to stress the global impact of the Jesuits as pioneer global diplomats dedicated to foreign service for the greater glory of God and the common good of global humanity. I'm going to analyze this impact through three different phases of globalization: the early modern phase before Western hegemony, the Western hegemony global colonial phase of modernity from the French Revolution to the 1960s, and our contemporary global age after Western hegemony from the 1960s to the present. These three world historical phases match neatly with the three phases of the Society of Jesus, from foundation in 1540 to suppression in 1773, from restoration in 1814 to the refounding in the 1960s under Father General Rupe, and from the 1960s to the present, accompanying the transformation of global Catholicism throughout the world. In all three phases, the Jesuits have functioned as diplomats dedicated to foreign service. But the meaning of foreign service had different connotations in each of these phases. When one Googles the definition of the noun diplomat, and now we all Google, we don't go back to the old dictionaries, one finds two related connotations. The first defines diplomat, quote, as an official representing a country abroad, end of quote, with such related synonyms as ambassador, envoy, emissary, consul, attaché, plenipotentiary, legate, and one could add papal or apostolic nuncio. The second, less official connotation of diplomat is, quote, a person who can deal with people in a sensitive and effective way, end of quote, with such related synonyms as tactful person, conciliator, reconciler, peacemaker, mediator, negotiator, intermediary, and one could add intercultural broker, practicing what the Jesuit Pope Francis has defined as the culture of the encounter. So let's look at the global impact of the Jesuits in the first phase of globalization. Like Father Walls, many extraordinary Jesuits have functioned as diplomats in the first official sense of the term throughout all three phases. In the early modern phase, one can think immediately of such paradigmatic figures as Francis Xavier, Antonio Posebino, or Thomas Pereira. Francis Xavier, the first Jesuit to be sent ad missiones, and the paradigmatic Jesuit missionary, was sent to the East Indies under the request of King John III of Portugal. Besides being, as it were, a royal emissary under the Portuguese padroado, that is, the royal patronage of the Church in Portugal's overseas territories, before departing from Lisbon in April 1541, Xavier received a papal brief appointing him apostolic nuncio to the East. Antonio Posebino, leading humanist scholar, counter-Reformation polemicist, and Latin secretary of Father General Everard Mercurian, was sent by Pope Gregory XIII in 1578 as papal legate to the court of King John III of Sweden in order to mediate in the Livonian War. After years of diplomatic missions through the Baltics and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Posebino was the first Jesuit to visit Muscovy during the reign of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. As a trusted emissary of Polish ruler Stefan Batory, in 1588, Posebino helped to mediate the peace treaty of Jan Zapolski, ending the wars between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Tsardom of Russia. As a Jesuit, a typical Jesuit, Posebino was also involved in the founding of Jesuit colleges throughout Europe, in Chambéry, France, in Turin, Piedmont, in Vilnius, Lithuania, in Braniewo, Poland, in Olomouc, Moravia, and in Cluj, Romania. All historically prestigious academic institutions still extant today. Retired from diplomacy by Father General Claudio Acquaviva, and banned from Rome as too political, Posebino retired to Padua, where he frequently conducted the Ignatian spiritual exercises, influencing, among others, the vocation of Saint Francis of Sales. Tomás Pereira, Jesuit in the China mission, was a mathematician, astronomer, musician, and trusted advisor of the Kangxi Emperor, who sent him as emissary to negotiate the 1689 Treaty of Nerchinsk with Russia. The authoritative version of the treaty was negotiated and written in Latin, primarily by Pereira on behalf of China, and by the Pole Andrei Bialowotsky on behalf of Russia. The Treaty of Nerchinsk established for the first time the territorial border between the two empires and the model of the Westphalian system of territorial states, and de facto served as the basis for Sino-Russian relations for almost 200 years until the Amur annexation in 1860. Francis Xavier, Antonio Posevino, and Tomás Pereira were extraordinary Jesuits who served as official diplomats or legates in the official sense of the term. Undoubtedly, all three had some global impact. But in my lecture today, I want to focus on the Jesuits as foreign diplomats in the second sense of the term, as intermediaries and dialogical brokers between peoples, cultures, and religions, who, above all, practice the culture of the encounter based on the principle of recognition and accommodation to the culture of the other. As is well known, Alessandro Balignano, as visitor of the Jesuit missions to the East, was the first to formulate explicitly what became known as the method of accommodation or enculturation. Balignano's official recommendation was based on the realization that Jesuits could never succeed in their mission to convert the Japanese to Christianity unless they themselves made an effort to adopt a Japanese habitus. Matteo Ricci, founder and pioneer of the Jesuit mission to China, was the first to implement Balignano's recommendation. In a sense, he himself embodied the method of accommodation. Accommodation was not simply a cunning strategy of conversion devised by European Jesuits. The practice emerged out of the intercultural encounter itself. In Japan, as well as in China, their local friends, the first Christians, taught the Jesuits the need to go native and to accommodate to local culture if they wanted to succeed. It was his friend and disciple, Chi Tu Tai Su, who first convinced Ricci of the need to abandon the habit of a Buddhist monk, which he had adopted at first upon entering China with Michele Ruggieri, and to assume instead the habitus of a Mandarin scholar. The ultimate goal of Ricci and the Jesuits who followed him was to penetrate the imperial court of Beijing and to convert the Chinese emperor. Yet Ricci realized soon that he himself would need to become first Chinese before the Chinese could possibly become Christians. It demanded an arduous enterprise of double translation of Latin texts and of European culture into Chinese, and of translation of Chinese texts and Chinese culture into Latin and into European culture. Ricci himself, through his own Sinicization, was the key to this collective enterprise in which European Jesuits, as well as Christian Confucian scholars, participated. The effect of the translation of Chinese classics and culture, first into Latin and then into European languages and cultures, mediated primarily by the China Jesuits, was crucial for European historical developments in the 18th century, particularly for the culture of the Enlightenment. I went to, as a side, a month ago, a great musical, and Matteo Ricci was initiated in Hong Kong by Chinese musicians talking about the arts and opera or theater designers, very successful. And indeed, the fact that in China, in Hong Kong, they can create a successful and actually profitable musical, and Matteo Ricci indicates the effect. In fact, most Chinese kids have heard of Ma Du Li, while probably most of the children in Macerata, which was the town from which Matteo Ricci came, never heard of Matteo Ricci. Ricci was followed in the China mission by many other Jesuit diplomats practicing the same culture of the encounter, who were actually able to penetrate the court of the Kangxi emperor and became his trusted tutors and advisors from his childhood, 6 years old, to the end of his long imperial reign. Among the most prominent were the Bavarian Adam Schall, the Flemish Ferdinand Verbies, the Czech Karel Slavicek, the Portuguese Pereira, and the French Gerbilon. In 1962, the Kangxi Emperor proclaimed the Edict of Toleration, officially recognizing Catholicism and the Jesuit missions and allowing the conversion of Chinese into Christianity. The edict, which came after a petition by Pereira, was proclaimed in recognition not only of Pereira's special service at the Treaty of Nerchinsk 3 years before, but also in recognition of the many other contributions that the court Jesuits had made during his reign, as directors of the Imperial Observatory, as reformers of the Chinese calendar, as geographers mapping the city of Beijing, as linguists, and as the introducers of Western science, technology, music, and the arts. To this list of prominent Jesuit diplomats in China, one could add the names of many other Jesuit missionaries practicing the method of accommodation as intercultural brokers in the East Indies. Roberto de Nobile in the Madurai Mission in India, Alexander Rhodes in Vietnam, Ippolito Desideri in Tibet. And one could add an equally long list of prominent Jesuit missionaries practicing a similar culture of the encounter and serving as intercultural brokers with the indigenous cultures in the New World of the Americas or in the West Indies. In fact, as we know, from the very beginning, every Jesuit took an oath to be sent ad missiones, that is, as missionaries by the Father General. Only a small proportion, perhaps no more than 10% of all Jesuits in the early modern era before the suppression, were sent overseas to the East or the West Indies. Of the many petitioned the Father General to be sent to the Indies, the majority had to accept being sent ad missiones at home throughout Europe, to run the hundreds of Jesuit colleges, to serve as court confessors and spiritual advisors of the European aristocracy, but also to serve as itinerant missionaries in the rural missions and in the inner cities, which soon came to be known as our local or domestic Indies at home. A discourse soon developed pointing out that the Jesuit domestic missions at home were as arduous, as beneficial, and as necessary as the foreign missions abroad, all being part of the same global salvific mission of the Society of Jesus. The mission to help souls ad maiorem Dei gloriam and for the common good was the same everywhere for every Jesuit, irrespective of national origin or country of destiny. Within the Society of Jesus, there was no sharp distinction between domestic and foreign. It was the unique organizational structure of the Society of Jesus that gave it its transnational and global character at the very moment when the Westphalian system of nation-states was being formed and consolidated. The names of the Jesuits in the China mission show that they came from every country and region of Europe, yet they were not at the service of any European nation-state. The same may be said about the names of most of the Jesuits who served in the Jesuit Indian redactions throughout Latin America, from Baja California to Chile and Paraguay. It was this relative autonomy from the very European Catholic powers who were the patrons of the Jesuit missions, as well as from the ordinary Catholic bishops and local church hierarchies, that made possible the organization of the Society of Jesus as a truly transnational global organization in the early modern era. But this relative autonomy was also the source of constant conflicts and tensions with the same Catholic powers and church hierarchies. Eventually, those tensions and conflicts assumed a critical dimension and became the reason for their expulsion from all the foreign missions by the Catholic rulers, and ultimately for the suppression of the Society by the Pope in 1773. Equally important for the organization of the Society of Jesus as a transnational global organization was its unique dual character as a society of global missionaries and global educators. This dual character, in turn, gave shape to what the historian of science, Stephen Harris, has characterized as the Jesuit global geography of knowledge. And instructions from Ignatius himself missionaries from the East and West Indies sent all kinds of novel information, natural, from the natural world, historical, geographic, demographic, ethnographic, linguistic, artistic, etc., to the most important Jesuit colleges in Europe. There it was first processed into new scientific knowledge and then globally distributed in print form, eventually reaching non-Jesuit institutions and publics, as well as Jesuit colleges and missions throughout the world. This virtuous feedback of global knowledge production between the global network of Jesuit colleges and the global network of Jesuit missions, the apostolate, made possible for the Jesuits to become pioneer globalizers in the first globalization. For over 2 centuries, from the 1540s to the 1760s, no other group contributed so much to the advancement of global connectivity and global consciousness, linking the 4 quadrants of the world. In a sense, the Society of Jesus, in advancing its global project of world evangelization, wished to function as a global NGO avant la lettre, ready to serve all the rulers, as well as all the polities, cultures, and societies of the world, but when wanting to remain autonomous from all of them, that is, without being subservient to any particular national or imperial geopolitical interest, under the motto of the greater glory of God and the common good of all of humanity. The project was dedicated to the formation of an open and plural global civil society, open to evangelization, but also to all forms of human intercultural exchange without regard for territorial borders. This global and transnational character of a Jesuit project without borders, wishing to function as a global NGO before its time, without regard for any distinction between domestic and foreign, naturally provoked deep suspicions everywhere. To the many critics of the Jesuits, it looked as if the society wanted to be both a state within the state, undermining every form of absolute sovereignty and an imperial power of its own, with a secret project of world domination. Let's not look now at the second phase of globalization under Western hegemony. Ultimately, the early modern Jesuit project of globalization was defeated by the alternative process of globalization carried out by the Westphalian system of nation-states and by the world capitalist system, which became hegemonic in the second phase of globalization. In today's lecture, I can only touch upon very briefly on the global impact of the Jesuits in the second Western hegemonic phase of globalization. After its restoration in 1814, the Society of Jesus had to operate under new conditions created by the accumulative secular forces of the Enlightenment, the French and American political revolutions, the industrial capitalist revolution, and new ideologies of economic and political liberalism carried jointly by the triumphant global capitalism and the globalization of the nation-state. Both the Catholic Church and the Jesuits were now on the defensive, no more the pioneer avant-garde of globalization, but rather what seemed to be a reactionary rear guard. The Jesuit transnational and Catholic identity and their global mobility assume now a new signification and meaning. The society's dual global missionary and educational ethos now had to adjust and interact with the 2 main structural dynamics of modern globalization. In the first place, the globalization of capital and labor produced a renewed European global colonial expansion, which contributed to the mass migration of European Catholics as well as of colonial subjects all over the world. The Jesuits now accompanied them as pastors on their overseas journeys. But the overseas journeys of European Jesuits were often directly produced by the secular anti-clerical policies of liberal nation-states bent on appropriating the mission of education from the Church and the Jesuits, who were viewed as anti-liberal transnational agents and were repeatedly sent into exile by European and Latin American states. Throughout the 19th century, The United States became a safe haven and refuge for European Jesuits sent into exile, a frontier missionary society in its own right, where they could serve both Catholic immigrants in the inner cities and Native Americans in their reservations, a place where they could build new educational institutions, over 20 colleges and universities, more freely than anywhere else in the world, and a platform from which to start anew the building or rebuilding of global Jesuit missions. Georgetown, established in 1789 by Bishop John Carroll during the interregnum between suppression and restoration, was the first and has remained the pioneer Jesuit educational institution in the United States. By the beginning of the 20th century, Jesuits were found again all over the globe, but paradoxically, their very institutional success and the domestic gravitational force of the nation state and of nationalism had made the Jesuits in the United States and elsewhere more sedentary, more domestic, and more accommodating to the national spirit of the age. From the very beginning, Ignatius and succeeding Father Generals had identified the national spirit as a constant threat from which the Society of Jesus had to protect itself deliberately to maintain its universal Catholic identity and its transnational organizational structure. But in the modern global age of nationalism, Jesuits everywhere were undergoing a new kind of nativist enculturation that made them more nationally local and domestic and less globally foreign and cosmopolitan. This temptation to succumb to the national spirit is illustrated tellingly by the fact that French and German Jesuits, who had been expelled from their countries during the culture wars of the 19th century, returned to their respective homes during World War I to serve in the front and to aid the national war effort. It was immediately after World War I, as we heard, that the School of Foreign Service was established at Georgetown. Despite the nativist, anti-immigrant spirit of the post-war period in the United States, not unlike the one reigning today, the School of Foreign Service was shaped by the open Catholic Americanism that has been a permanent feature of Jesuit Georgetown since its foundation. In his address at the opening of SFS, Father Walsh indicated that the technical training of the new pioneering institution in the American education, quote, should rest squarely upon a broad and liberal education combining the best elements of age-long cultural traditions with the bracing atmosphere of individuality characteristic of our educational institutions in the United States, end of quote. Father Walsh always maintained that international relations should be developed from both ends, at home and abroad, domestic and foreign, simultaneously. SFS was to function not only as a school of future diplomats and career men, and women, we would say today, it was also to serve as a center for the development of international goodwill and understanding. Ultimately, in the words of Father Louis Gallagher, companion Jesuit and biographer of Father Walsh, quote, the spirit animating the entire undertaking was the spirit of a Christian understanding of international brotherhood developed in the family of nations under the fatherhood of God, end of quote. In other words, it was to be a Jesuit enterprise for the greater glory of God and the common good of global humanity. So let's just look at our historical juncture, our present. One can date the beginning of our contemporary global age to the very moment when humanity becomes reflexively aware that the global connectivity and global consciousness are signs of the times. And thus, a new term, globalization, needed to be coined to express this reflexive awareness. From the perspective of this lecture, this moment of reflexive awareness is marked by the experience of the Second Vatican Council, the first truly global ecumenical council of the Catholic Church, and by the parallel refounding of the Society of Jesus under Father General Pedro Arrupe. Without yet using the term, the three final documents of the Council refer clearly to the phenomenon of globalization as a new world historical moment, as a sign of the times, intrinsically related with the mystery of God's plans of salvation, which demand our serious discernment. The Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, proclaims the inalienable right of every individual to religious freedom as a new self-evident truth, which is grounded in the sacred dignity of the human person created in the image of God. The declaration of the relation of the Church with non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, our age, demands that we recognize intercultural and interreligious dialogue as a fundamental task and duty for us Christians and for all humans. The Constitution of the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, stresses the need for the human integral development of all peoples and societies on earth in justice and peace, and demands the commitment of the people of God to contribute to a new, more fair, just, and peaceful form of globalization. The refounded Society of Jesus has clearly committed itself to each of these principles as central to its renewed task of world evangelization. In a sense, a globalization predicated on those principles offers a partial vindication of the original early modern project of world evangelization. Today, the Jesuits have built again very important or some important global networks with an active presence throughout the world. But those networks are relatively much smaller, less central, and more removed from the current hegemonic economic, political, and ideological forces of globalization. Its global impact today can therefore not be comparable to that of the early modern era. More significantly, Jesuits today find themselves increasingly at the peripheries rather than at the center of globalization. Their mission has been transformed and at times has become controversial again, particularly in its commitment to the preferential option for the poor, in the struggle for social justice and peace, and in its welcoming openness to immigrants and refugees. The mission of the Society of Jesus is being defined less by conversion and civilization and more by its witness and accompaniment of the people at the margins, those who are being affected most negatively by contemporary process of globalization. Their mission is in this respect anti-systemic and against the current. Jesuits are not and can never be against globalization per se, but they also cannot but be critical of a particular hegemonic form of globalization, shaped by neoliberal global capitalism and by the national security interests of the dominant states, which reproduce unequal, unjust, and discriminatory structures. In this respect, the Jesuit mission is no different from that of the global Catholic Church, particularly now that one of their own, from the global periphery of the southern cone of Latin America, has become, for the first time, the universal Bishop of Rome, and has adopted the name of Francis to signify that he wants to be Pontifex, that is, bridge builder of the poor, of peace, and of our common home, the earth, with all its creatures. This is a papacy that wants to be defined by the culture of the encounter, by building bridges rather than walls between nations, cultures, and peoples, erasing borders and boundaries, particularly those that are discriminatory and reproduce unjust inequalities. A papacy that proclaims with words and deeds the corporal and spiritual works of mercy as the core and the joy of the gospel, and defines the task of evangelization as the mission not just of clerics and professional religious orders, but as the universal task of the people of God and the duty of each and every Christian. A papacy that defines the church, the universal church, as well as the continental, the national, and the local parish church, not as a hierarchical clerical institution, but as a community of communities of service. Not a self-referential church, self-enclosing its temple, but a church open to the plazas of the world that serves as a field hospital for the wounded, for the sinners, for the most needy. Pope Francis' encyclicals Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si point precisely to our historical juncture in the present phase of globalization and signal what our Catholic and Jesuit response ought to be. To a certain extent, capitalist globalization and the revolution in digital media have created the kind of open global civil society with relatively porous borders, which the early modern Jesuit project of world evangelization presupposed. In itself, an open global civil society is one of the conditions for any kind of universal human globalization. But neoliberal capitalism privileges open borders for financial capital and for certain types of labor power, which can be turned into use value for profit and capital accumulation. But as Pope Francis has insisted, it is indifferent and discriminates against those persons who do not possess useful labor power and thus become systemically discardable. The problem of contemporary capitalism is not so much the exploitation of proletarian and post-colonial labor in the peripheries of the system, but the indifference of the center for those peripheries, foreign as well as domestic, which it considers of marginal utility. This is one of the new boundaries of discrimination created by the new global capitalist division of labor. The other is the internal boundaries of growing inequality, which it produces within the system, not only between center and periphery, but also between different types of capital and between different kinds of labor. As the new forms of working class anti-globalization populism in the very advanced capitalist societies make evident, it is not labor exploitation per se, but the realization of being left behind and becoming marginal for the function of the system that produces the nativist resentment and the fear against the knowledge elites and against the power and privileges of the knowledge class. It is the knowledge class which is really the crucial boundary of inequality today. Education and the production of knowledge are areas in which the Jesuits have considerable experience and some global networks and resources with which to address the issue. Of course, realistically, given its small size relative to the world's population, the Jesuits cannot do it alone. But they can serve as a global network of networks, addressing the fundamental problems created by the unequal and unequal globalization, the problem of the unequal distribution of access to knowledge, the need to help and to accompany those who are excluded and discarded by both by global capitalism and by the global system of nation states, primarily immigrants and refugees. In a sense, Jesuit initiatives of the last decades, such as Jesuit Refugee Service, as well as educational initiatives such as Fe y Alegría, Entre Culturas, Cristo Rey Schools, and Jesuit Worldwide Learning, have identified some of the crucial global problems which the Jesuits can effectively address. But the Jesuits cannot do it alone. They have to promote larger and wider networks of networks that can collaborate and work together towards the more universal common good. The society will need to reflect upon the inevitable boundaries created by membership in the society of Jesus itself. A society worthy of the name of Jesus will need to find ways of inviting each and every person who wants to become a companion of Jesus and work towards a globalization of fraternity to have access and participate in the society networks. A serious reflection on the clerical sexual abuse within the entire church forces us to reflect also upon the discriminatory sinful boundaries produced by clericalism and gender discrimination within the church, which are one of the primary sources of the abuse of power over others, over children and over women. Do not worry, Father Spadaro, I'm not calling here at Rome, within the grounds of Civiltà Cattolica, for the creation of a female branch of the Society of Jesus. But the Society of Jesus has a unique opportunity and responsibility to assume the global mission of creating within all Jesuit networks and institutions that are informed by Ignatian spirituality the kind of exemplary structures in which there is no room for clerical or gender discriminatory unequal power and domination. This could be the kind of new pioneering global mission which the Society of Jesus could assume as a service to the universal church for the greater glory of God, the common good of global humanity, and the whole of creation. At this centennial celebration, the School of Foreign Service and the entire Georgetown community could assume as its renewed task and unique opportunity the promotion of new forms of diplomatic service in the dual sense of international mediation to establish friendly, just, and fair relations between polities, and the construction of an open, pluralist, and solidarist global civil society which is responsive to the needs of our multipolar, multilateral, multicultural, and multi-religious global age. Thank you.
Wow. That was truly remarkable, Jose. Thank you. And before I open it up to questions from the audience, because we do have some time for conversation, I got the sense that you enjoyed preparing this lecture, that you learned something too about the School of Foreign Service and how Georgetown fits into this wider narrative. Can you tell us a little bit about the process and what it meant to you personally to be able to give this address? Yeah.
Well, first let me tell you, when I came to Georgetown, it was for me a way of going back to my early student days of theology in Innsbruck with the Jesuits. But I have to admit, I had incorporated the black legend. I thought the Jesuits were these guys, transnational papists, that basically they were rightly suppressed and expelled from every country. I really, I was a liberal, basically democratic thinker. And I realized, or it took me to reflect upon what they could teach us about the early modern globalization that we need to learn again for our global age after Western hegemony. So this was for me a great experience. So it was the beginning of a kind of learning. But I have to admit, I've been on the outskirts of the School of Foreign Service. I don't think that I've ever had any kind of formal link in any kind of communication or collaboration with the School of Foreign Service. So it was for me, in this respect, or Father Walls, I knew of him about this called warrior. But of course, I mean, I come from Spain myself, but my wife is Ukrainian. So what the Soviet Union represents is very, very strong for me. And of course, the Ukrainian famine is the crucial experience of the 20th century in the United States. And he experienced already immediately how the Soviet system was creating artificial famines. Well before the huge famine of the 30s, you had already famines created by revolution, war, and especially by the policies of the regime. So this was a way in which, and again, recognizing that he had been going through all these places as a diplomat in very difficult mediations. And I couldn't add the fact that he was sent after World War II as visitor to Japan to precisely make a report on the Jesuit mission in Japan, when actually was under Father Arrupe, visited all the 3 universities or colleges and all the 23 Jesuit missions in Japan, wrote his report, then came back, and is when he founded the School of Linguistics with Father Dostert. So again, it was the recognition of the importance of language learning for the early missionaries in Japan and China that basically was. So it made me view the School of Foreign Service not as a school of foreign service for the United States, but something was much more linked to the global foreign service of the Jesuits. So this was for me the learning experience.
Thank you. So we do have some time for questions. If anyone wants to challenge him on some historical details.
Don't even try.
Yes, here's Sarah. Yeah. Here we go.
You reassured Father Spadaro that you are not, let's say, encouraging the creation of a women's chapter, shall we say, of the Society of Jesus. But what are you suggesting that the Jesuits...
Well, you know, ultimately the question is not access so that whoever was discriminated against reproduces the structure, but to change the structure of discrimination itself. I mean, there was no female branch of the Society of Jesus, but all of the women's orders established after the Society of Jesus were follow the model of the Society of Jesus. They were to be not nuns of cloister, but nuns in the world dedicated to education, health, service. So this is really, and they want to have their constitutions the way the Jesuits had their own constitutions, not run by bishops, but run, of course. The church was not ready to give them the autonomy that the popes gave to the Jesuits at this particular moment. They wouldn't have gotten in the 19th century either, the Jesuits. But the fact is that in this respect, there was one woman Jesuit at the very beginning, but this experience was a very negative one, and so, it was a secret woman Jesuit. No, I mean, what I mean is really, we are in a very unique moment of crisis of the Catholic Church. And I think we address this issue. And the sexual abuse we have to recognize is primarily linked to structures of discrimination based on clericalism and based basically on male clericalism. And so I think that it behooves the culture of the encounter to create a structure where women can have very strong voices in all the Jesuit institutions and to become models of what basically every form of church institution should be. It may be that the Jesuits give the inspiration, the spirituality, but ultimately they can be run very well by women, many of those Jesuit institutions. So I hope that they are really able to participate in, even if necessary, to renew whatever Ignatian spirituality means from the point of view of women, right?
Thank you. Here.
Yes, I'm Johannes Erat from the Pontifical Gregorian University. We had so much incense now here in this room that I hope that that it doesn't get in too much in our eyes. I want to ask this question. We were talking about higher education, which is a comparative. We were talking about leadership, which is asymmetric. It's basically what we are talking about all the time is elites. So I'm aware that it is basically futile to think a world without elites. The question for us Jesuits, I mean, the Gregorian is doing that in that business for 480 years, and it's certainly, I'm very convinced it has been beneficial historically. But the question for us would be, how do we get the elites to give back to the ones who are not elites what they gained in asymmetry, power, whatever cloud,
yes.
whatever you want?
Yes. Well, obviously, this was this is what I call the refounding with Father Rupemen. In Latin America, it was very clear. You had in the 60s a lot of elite schools that actually closed and decided to go to the ghettos and to the neighborhoods and basically dedicate themselves simply to a pastorate of the poorest. In India, the Jesuit schools before were educating the high caste Brahmins. Now they decided that they don't need to educate the Hindus, the high caste Hindus. They should educate the outcast, the untouchables, and the indigenous people, which are basically discriminated. So most of the Jesuit education in India today is dedicated even to literacy, So it's not anymore. But of course, so in this respect today, they are doing this already. But the question, what my concern is, and I'm we should not go too far in the opposite direction of abandoning the apostolate of the intelligentsia, not of the elites. I'm not trying to educate, but the apostolate of the intelligentsia. And to have, because it's not enough to try to ameliorate and to accompany these victims of globalization. We need to be there to have a voice wherever the powers, the centers of globalization are there to challenge the model. And you can only do that if you really, really know economics and politics and law. So you have to have. You cannot, and this is my main concern, as precisely as the society moves to the south, that we abandon the great intellectual tradition. And I see it in India, this is a challenge. How you do move to not to be with the elites and yet still play a role in the public sphere, challenging the official centers of hegemonic power in its society. And so it is a thing in which the School of Foreign Service should not simply close. It needs to educate precisely elites, but it has to educate him precisely, well, women and men for other, which are dedicated to service beyond themselves, right, in their career.
Thank you. We have a question in the back. John?
Thank you, Jose. John Borelli, Georgetown University. And I know the bulk of your remarks were on the centuries leading up to World War I, and many of those figures we look upon as legendary in the development of interreligious attitudes in the Catholic Church. But in your opening remarks on the formation of the School of Foreign Service, 1919, after the First World War, at the Catholic University and the Jesuit University, first one in the United States, and the senior one in Washington, D.C., because by then Catholic University of America existed. The U.S. bishops were also transitioning. Their National Catholic War Council, right, their first structure, national structure among themselves, was changed to National Catholic Welfare Council, and then went through a period of almost suppression by the Holy See because of the word council. And they had to struggle to get it back, and they changed it to conference. Then Edmund Walsh was invited to be the first president of their organization, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. So the fact of the school, the National NCWC, and Kaniwa has a lot to do with Catholics in the United States coming into a kind of recognized national body, don't you think?
Of course, and this was a time precisely when the Catholic Church, despite the accusation of the Americanist heresy, precisely because it was becoming really a national center linked to the formation of what was the beginning of also a really central federal government that had not operated as such. It was World War I that then led to the Depression, and then of course the New Deal, in which precisely you could say that some of the projects of the New Deal have been thought first within this Council of the Catholic Church. So yes, this is very important. And let's not forget that it was at a time when what eventually will become the self-evident truths of precisely religious freedom as a crucial component were then shaped by also American Jesuits, and only later will be translated into a theological language for the global church. So yes, this I think is a formative period, the same way that you have then the formative period of Jesuits in France, in Germany, who eventually really open up a new way of being in the world, of developing new types of theologies, which many of them will end as perity, let's say, in the Vatican Council. So yeah, this is from World War I to the 50s. This is a period in which a transformation takes place within the Society of Jesus. Janssen himself, obviously, as a new Father General, open to Latin America, that basically, after all, he had been the professor of Hurtado in Louvain, and was very much part already of these links being developed, let's say, with Latin American Catholicism and social justice and what was then Catholic action. So yes, this is a formative period of what then will become real in Vatican II.
So we have time for one more question, right over here.
Raffaele Marchetti from Lewis University. Thank you very much for this wonderful sort of historical reconstruction. It was really enlightening. But what was more interesting for me was sort of how it speaks to a contemporary debate. You know, this cleavage between localists and globalists. And it seems to me that this tradition that you reconstructed really provides an innovative way of combining a global appeal with some rootedness. The idea that it's not only kind of, as it's sometimes said, is rooted cosmopolitanism, but it's you are rooted in a certain place, but you are also sort of open to get into another place, like Matteo Ricci and all the other enculturation tradition. So this was very interesting for me, and I wanted to understand how you see this history that you reconstructed in light of this tension, which is, I would say, a key tension today, rather than left and right, globalist, localist, that it seems to me.
Well, they were local. They were local, global and local, because they were rooted, they were enculturated. And it's true that they did not have the global networks directly in the way of acting, but the consciousness was there. I mean, in the college in Mexico City, you have immediately after the news, the news of the martyrs in Japan reaches Mexico before it reaches Europe, before it reaches Rome. And immediately the college creates a theater performance precisely celebrating the sanctity of these Japanese martyrs. And you go to indigenous missions, the Incas near Cusco, and you will see the frescoes, and you have frescoes representing cultures from all over the world. In 16th century, an indigenous village near Cusco, in the center of the Inca Empire. So there was a global connectivity, consciousness between, so global colleges, the Jesuits, that's what I have called the geography of knowledge, was there. They could not act globally, so they had to act globally only by acting locally, but they were very conscious. The global consciousness was there, and they did reproduce global consciousness wherever they went. We are thinking of how to develop, let's say, a universal education, liberal arts for our contemporary multicultural humanity. Well, if you look at the colleges, let's say, in Macau, first already in Funei in Japan, they were teaching not only Latin and Greek, but the Chinese and Japanese classics, because they thought, of course, we cannot only teach those Japanese former or eventual Jesuits candidates to become Jesuit priests into the cultures of the Greeks and the Latins. I mean, it was the recognition. Look, every college, early college, Sao Paulo in Brazil, São Pablo in Lima, São Paul in Goa, São Paul in Macau. They call it São Pablo because they thought they were doing to the new Gentiles, the global Gentiles, what São Paul did to the Gentiles. But they knew that in the same way that Christianity at the beginning was Greek and Latin, didn't come in one single version. For Christianity that was originally Hebrew, to become universal had to go and become Greek and Latin. And they thought, well, if it became Greek and Latin, it could become Japanese and Chinese. And so the idea that universalism can only be true universalism if it is particular everywhere. So it cannot be a universal cosmopolitanism, it has to be universal particularism, every concrete. So this was something that was already built into their conception of a universal Christianity, which itself is not European. This was very important. The Jesuits were convinced of the superiority of Christianity as a religion, but not of the superiority of European culture. They recognized the Japanese culture, Chinese culture for them was superior to the culture of the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance from which they came from. And they write about it. And so it was precisely because Christianity was non-European, has no particular culture that could become incarnated in every particular culture. And Christianity could only become universal if it became particular everywhere. And so this was, they did it just out of this intercultural encounter. They had no theology of it. Today we have the theology of it. We can reflect on it. But the experience was there and it came out of the practice itself. So.
Well, Jose, your keynote in this discussion, I think, has been a fitting end to an exciting afternoon. We've had a chance to look at the global impact of the Jesuits from many different angles to celebrate SFS and the centennial against that backdrop. We've also got some calls to action that have emerged out of each of the panels, a source of reflection for Georgetown and the society, I would hope, going forward. In conclusion of our formal activities and anticipation of our reception together downstairs, just some thanks at the end of the day to President DeGioia and Dean Hellman and Father Spadaro for bringing us together here for this wonderful day of reflection, to the staff who've made this possible, to Erin and Shamong from Georgetown, to Marta and her team here at Civiltà. And in conclusion, I hope you'll join me again in thanking my friend and colleague, Jose Casanova. Thank you.